Welcome to the First Earth, a place where time doesn't hurry, and science unfolds the way the Earth itself unfolds. Slowly, with dignity, and with remarkable discoveries waiting around every turn. Today we won't be talking about years or decades. We're going on a journey where even the word ancient feels too young to carry the weight of what we're about to explore. We're going back to the Mesozoic, an era that lasted nearly 200 million years and left its fingerprints on every rock face, every gene, every coastline of the world we call home. Tonight, or this morning, or whatever quiet hour you've chosen for this, we are going back together to the strangest and most magnificent version of Earth that ever existed. Take a moment and think about where you are right now. Maybe it's night outside and the city is slowly settling into quiet. The hum of traffic fading, the lights in neighboring windows going dark one by one. Or perhaps it's morning and the day is just beginning to unfold, that particular kind of stillness before everything starts again. There's something curious about that, isn't there? Sitting here in our own present moment, in our own familiar world, while trying to imagine one that lies hundreds of millions of years behind us. The same planet, the same sky above it, and yet a world so different from ours that if you were dropped there without warning, you might not even recognize it as Earth. If this slow journey brings you something, a little wonder, a little peace, a sense of how deep the story goes, stay with us. Subscribe if you'd like more of these quiet wanderings into the depths of time. But for now, let the Earth tell its longest and most astonishing story. To truly see the Mesozoic, we first need to let go of everything we know today. Close your eyes and try to picture a planet without the familiar outlines of continents. No America, no Africa, no Europe standing in their known places. No Atlantic Ocean stretching between them. No Indian Ocean, no Arctic Sea as we understand it. Instead, a single enormous landmass stretching across most of the globe, surrounded by one vast and nearly boundless ocean on all sides. This supercontinent was called Pangaea, from the ancient Greek meaning all the earth. And for tens of millions of years before our story even begins, it was simply the only kind of world there was. One land, one ocean, and above them both, a sky thick with the breath of volcanoes. The oceans surrounding Pangaea were vast in ways the mind struggles to hold. A single great sea, sometimes called Panthalassa, wrapped around most of the planet. It was so wide that a storm born in its center might travel for weeks before reaching land. The air smelled different, not unpleasantly, but strangely. Plants exhaled chemical compounds into the sky that no human lung has ever drawn in. The ratio of oxygen to carbon dioxide was not what we breathe today. Volcanoes were far more active than in our time, constantly reshaping the atmosphere with their outbursts, pouring sulfur and carbon dioxide into the air in quantities that would have been alarming to any modern sense of the world. And strange conifer forests crept across the drier landscapes, not the pine forests you might know, but something older and stranger, while at their roots small mammals, tiny and quiet, hid themselves in the shadows, barely noticed, biding their time. If you had found yourself standing there, you wouldn't have recognized even the sounds. No birdsong as you know it, not the morning chorus that might be drifting through your window right now. No buzzing of bees, because flowers had not yet made their grand entrance onto the stage, and with no flowers, there was little reason for bees. Instead, the calls of early reptiles, low and rasping. the crash of surf against unfamiliar coastlines shaped by continental edges that no map you've ever seen would show. The rustle of cycads in the wind, those ancient palm-like plants with stiff, dark green fronds that looked the same 100 million years ago as the few species that survive today. And underneath it all, the deep geological patience of a world still reshaping itself. This was an Earth in recovery, because before the Mesozoic began, the world had passed through one of its darkest and most violent hours. The mass extinction at the end of the Permian period, sometimes called the Great Dying, wiped out perhaps 90% of all marine species and an enormous portion of those on land. It was caused primarily by catastrophic volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia, which poured so much carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that oceans acidified, global temperatures spiked, and oxygen levels in the deep sea dropped to near zero. It was not a quick death. It was a prolonged unraveling that took hundreds of thousands of years. And when it was over, the Earth was left nearly emptied. Its ecosystems reduced to fragments, its food webs severed, its most spectacular lineages simply gone. The Mesozoic was the slow rebuilding project that followed. When you think about that, the entire era takes on a very different flavor. It was not just a random chapter filled with strange creatures parading past in a prehistoric zoo. It was life experimenting again after the worst catastrophe it had ever known, trying new shapes, filling new roles, discovering possibilities that had never been tried before. Every dinosaur, every pterosaur, every flowering plant was, in a sense, a solution to a problem that extinction had created. Imagine the horizon stretching across the deserts of early Pangaea. You would see broad red landscapes baked under a hot sun, not the deep arterial red of Mars, but the earthier red-brown of iron-rich sandstone, the color of dried blood and ancient clay. Rivers cut through those landscapes, carrying life in narrow ribbons of green across otherwise barren expanses, the way thin threads of silk run through rough cloth. Walk toward a river, and the world would change. The smell of water, of mud, of growing things. Amphibians sprawled at the water's edge, their moist skin glistening. Insects moved through low vegetation. The air shimmered with heat away from the riverbank, but here, in the shade of the earliest ferns and horsetails, it was almost cool. And somewhere in the undergrowth, small and quick and easy to miss, the ancestors of the great dinosaurs were only just beginning to stir. The earth was wide open. The niches emptied by extinction were waiting to be filled. And evolution, patient, restless, indifferent to any plan, moved in to answer that invitation the only way it knows how, by trying everything at once. Of course, speaking about the Mesozoic as a single thing is a little misleading. This era lasted from roughly 252 to 66 million years ago. Nearly 186 million years of change, continents shifting, climates transforming, species rising and falling like waves. For comparison, the entire span of recorded human history amounts to just a few thousand years. Our species has been around for perhaps 300,000 years in total. The Mesozoic lasted more than 600 times longer than that. It lasted long enough for entire mountain ranges to form and erode completely away. Long enough for the Atlantic Ocean, which did not exist at the start of it, to grow from a narrow rift to a proper ocean. Long enough for the same evolutionary processes that gave us mice to run their course dozens of times over, producing monsters and miracles that no imagination could have predicted. To call it an era almost undersells it. It was more like a whole separate age of the world, with its own internal history as complex as anything that has come before or since. And yet, when most people hear the word Mesozoic, they think of dinosaurs, and not without reason. But focusing only on them means missing the true scale of what this Earth actually was. Because the Mesozoic was not just the age of dinosaurs, it was the age of new oceans tearing open between continents as Pangaea slowly fragmented into the pieces we now know as home. The age of evolutionary experiments in the skies and seas that have no equivalent in the modern world. The age of a climate that swung between greenhouse heat and cooler, wetter stretches. A climate so fundamentally different from today that there were no permanent ice caps anywhere on Earth for most of those 186 million years. The age of plants quietly reinventing the landscape, first without flowers, and then, late in the era, with them, transforming what the world looked like, smelled like, and tasted like. And woven through all of it is a story about resilience, about what life does when the rules change, and about how the world we live in was shaped in ways we rarely stop to notice. Right there's where something hides that you probably didn't expect to learn. Think back for a moment to what the sky looked like then. Today we are used to birds wheeling overhead, the quick dart of a swallow, the lazy circles of a hawk riding a thermal, the neat formations of geese crossing an autumn sky. It seems as natural as breathing. But back in the Mesozoic, the first birds were only just appearing, their feathers more primitive, their flight a little more clumsy, their small dinosaurian ancestry still clearly written in the architecture of their bodies. They were experiments in progress, not finished things. The undisputed rulers of the Mesozoic sky, for nearly its entire span, were the pterosaurs. Wings stretched across enormously elongated fourth fingers, their surfaces made not of feathers, but of a complex membrane reinforced with internal fibers, flexible and strong in ways we are still studying. Some pterosaurs were the size of a sparrow, hunting insects above the fern beds. Others were as large as a small airplane, riding thermals over open ocean, casting shadows on the water below. They circled over coastlines, dove for fish, scavenged along beaches in groups the way vultures gather today. Their shadows fell across the dunes and across the backs of dinosaurs that never once looked up. Now picture those oceans, the ones those shadows fell across, waters alive with reptiles that had abandoned land entirely, reversing over millions of years the great transition that had first brought vertebrates onto dry ground. Sleek ichthyosaurs, their bodies shaped so perfectly like dolphins that for a long time scientists assumed they must be related. They were not. Surged after shoals of fish in the warm, shallow Tethys Sea. Long-necked plesiosaurs moved like living myths through open water, their four great flippers rowing them forward with slow, powerful strokes, their small heads darting at the surface to snatch fish or at depth to pursue squid. In the later stretches of the Mesozoic, great mosasaurs came to dominate the seas, massive lizards, cousins of the modern monitor, that had taken to the water and grown to terrifying size, with double-hinged jaws capable of swallowing prey whole. The seas themselves were chemically different from today. Coral reefs were built not only by corals, but by strange organisms called rudists, thick-shelled mollusks that grew in dense reefs the way corals do now, and that have no living descendants. And ammonites, spiral-shelled relatives of squid, their shells sometimes smooth, sometimes wildly ornamented with ribs and spines and tubercles, drifted by the millions through every ocean on Earth, from pole to pole, a living constant of the Mesozoic seas. On land, the forests were thick with conifers, cycads, and ginkgos. Imagine trees rising like pillars, their crowns spreading broad and dark, blocking so much light that the forest floor beneath them existed in a kind of permanent green twilight. The ground carpeted with unfamiliar ferns and horsetails taller than a person, their geometry ancient and mathematical, their surfaces waxy with a cuticle evolved to prevent water loss. The smell of resin was thick in the warm air. There were no flowering trees, no maples turning gold in autumn, no magnolias opening white blossoms in the spring, no smell of apple blossom carried on a warm breeze, because none of those things existed yet. Instead, greens, browns, and grays, with the occasional cones of gymnosperms fallen onto the forest floor and the soft drip of moisture from leaves after rain. It was a quieter palette than the world we know, and a quieter fragrance. And into this world came the dinosaurs. At first they were small, almost inconspicuous, darting through undergrowth after insects, competing with other reptiles for survival, easily overlooked in a world still dominated by crocodile relatives and sprawling therapsids. But they carried within them a set of advantages that would, given time and opportunity, become decisive. Upright legs that supported their weight efficiently, lungs that moved air in a continuous one-way loop rather than in and out of a dead-end sac, and bone structure suggesting growth rates faster than most contemporary reptiles. Slowly they spread, adapting into new forms wherever opportunity arose. Some walked on 2 legs, some on 4. Some shifted fluidly between both, depending on what they were doing. Over time, some lineages grew into giants, unlike anything that had walked the earth before. Sauropods stretching longer than a line of buses, their necks rising like living cranes above the treetops, their footsteps leaving depressions in the earth large enough to collect rainwater and become temporary ponds. Alongside them rose the predators, from small feathered hunters that operated in coordinated groups to the enormous solitary giants of the late Cretaceous, creatures like Tyrannosaurus with a bite force greater than any land animal before or since. But the Mesozoic was not only a tale of giants, it was also a time of subtlety. The first mammals creeping through the undergrowth under cover of darkness, insects adapting constantly to the changing plant life around them, ecosystems weaving themselves into ever more intricate and beautiful networks of dependency. 3 acts: Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. 3 great movements of a single sprawling piece, and each one begins differently, shaped by what came before it. The Triassic begins in the shadow of loss, in the wreckage of the Permian extinction. The Earth had just endured the most devastating mass extinction in its entire history. The oceans had been stripped of most of their life. Reefs that had taken hundreds of millions of years to build dissolved in acidified water. Land was left bare where forests and swamps had once stretched, bare in a way that is hard to picture if you have never seen a landscape truly emptied of life. Not just sparse, but genuinely hollow. For a time, the world must have seemed almost quiet, with broken ecosystems, severed food chains, and the few survivors scattered thinly across vast stretches of a wounded planet, each of them a remnant of something that had once been complex and whole. Plants were among the first to recover, spreading wherever conditions allowed. Ferns often led the way onto disturbed ground, as they still do today after wildfires or volcanic eruptions. Their spores light enough to travel on the wind for hundreds of kilometers. Behind the ferns came hardier conifers and cycads, their seeds armored against drought, their roots patient enough to crack bare rock over decades. Gradually, landscapes stripped to bare stone greened again, tentatively at first, then more confidently, and as the plant cover returned, it brought with it the moisture retention and soil chemistry that allowed other life to follow. The animals that survived had to adapt to a world with minimal stability, where the rules were still being written. Amphibians, though reduced in number and no longer the dominant creatures they had been in earlier ages, still lived along rivers and lakes, some of them surprisingly large, their broad flat skulls and ambush postures giving them away as predators of shallow water. Early reptiles of every imaginable form filled the gaps left by extinction. The Triassic was crowded with evolutionary experiments that would leave no descendants. Armored herbivores with bodies like low tanks, predators with sail-like neural spines on their backs, small agile things that seemed to be testing forms in advance of the body plans that would eventually succeed. Among the most important survivors were the archosaurs, a group whose descendants include crocodiles, pterosaurs, dinosaurs, and, through the dinosaurs, every bird alive today. In the early Triassic, they were modest, unassuming creatures, but they carried something their competitors lacked: a lung that extracted oxygen with extraordinary efficiency, a posture that placed their legs directly beneath their bodies rather than out to the sides, and a reproductive and metabolic biology that seems to have allowed faster growth and greater adaptability than the sprawling reptiles around them. For tens of millions of years, they existed alongside larger, seemingly more formidable creatures. But they held on. They waited for their moment. They endured two catastrophes, the Permian extinction and then another volcanic crisis at the end of the Triassic itself. And each time they came through. And when the world on the other side was emptied again, they were still there. And that is when the age of dinosaurs truly began. Dinosaurs in the early Triassic were small, light, and fast, not particularly impressive compared to the bulkier reptiles around them. But slowly they spread, first in the background, then in ever greater numbers, then as the dominant land animals of the planet. And by the end of the Triassic, when volcanic eruptions tied to the breakup of Pangaea killed off most of their competitors for the second time, the dinosaurs found themselves in a world of open niches and almost no one left to challenge them. The Jurassic that followed was their inheritance. But to truly understand their dominance, you first have to understand the world in which they reigned, and that world breathed. The atmosphere of the Mesozoic was not a passive backdrop. It was a living partner in the great drama of evolution. It shaped what was possible, what could grow, how large creatures could become, how far they could range. In the early Triassic, oxygen levels were low, and carbon dioxide was excessive, left elevated by the same volcanism that had caused the Permian extinction. Global temperatures soared, particularly at the poles, erasing any meaningful seasonal temperature gradient. Much of Pangaea baked under a permanent subtropical high pressure, creating the vast deserts that dominated its interior. Only animals with efficient respiratory systems and bodies adapted to heat could function reliably in those conditions. It was a world built for reptiles, and the archosaurs, with their superior lungs, were its most successful tenants. By the Jurassic, The atmosphere had shifted again, responding to the fragmentation of Pangaea and the opening of new ocean basins that brought moisture deeper into the continental interiors. Oxygen levels rose. Some estimates placed Jurassic oxygen concentrations several percentage points above what we breathe today. That combination, abundant oxygen and elevated carbon dioxide under a warm, stable climate, allowed plants to grow with remarkable speed and in remarkable quantity. Forests spread farther from the equator than at any earlier time. The food supply for large herbivores became effectively inexhaustible, and into that world of plenty, the sauropods expanded. When you look at a mounted sauropod skeleton in a museum, the neck rising above you, the tail stretching away behind, the sheer scale of the thing making the people standing near it look like children, you are not only seeing an evolutionary achievement, you are seeing a creature shaped by its atmosphere. The air itself was part of why those sizes were possible. The Jurassic climate was generally wetter and more equable than the early Triassic, with monsoon systems sweeping deep into the continental interiors and forests spreading into latitudes that had previously been desert. The seasonal extremes that had punished the early Triassic faded as the continents separated and ocean currents moderated temperatures. Even the polar regions, where winter brought months of near-total darkness, were mild enough to support forests of ginkgos and conifers. Dinosaurs living at high latitudes, and we know they did, from fossils found in Alaska, Australia, and Antarctica, adapted to those long, dark winters in ways we are still working to understand, some perhaps migrating toward lower latitudes, others physiologically equipped to endure months of reduced food supply. The Earth was warm from equator to pole. There were no ice caps anywhere on the planet. The greenhouse effect was steady and powerful, and would remain so for the rest of the Mesozoic. The Cretaceous, the final act, brought yet another atmospheric shift, more extreme than anything that had come before within the era. Carbon dioxide levels climbed to perhaps 4 to 6 times their modern concentration. Sea levels rose dramatically as the volume of the ocean increased with warming, not suddenly, but over millions of years, creeping up the continental margins until vast areas of what had been dry land became warm, shallow inland seas. The climate was intensely warm and humid, with tropical and subtropical conditions extending to latitudes that are temperate today. What is now the Canadian prairie was once a coastal wetland edged by forests containing palms. What is now the Sahara was a mosaic of rivers, swamps, and gallery forests. And crucially, it was in the Cretaceous that flowering plants first spread widely across the world, transforming the land surface more dramatically than any development since plants first colonized it. The air carried new scents, the sweetness of early blossoms mingling with the familiar resin of conifers, a change not only in chemistry, but in the entire sensory character of the world. For the first time, the land smelled faintly, distantly, like the world we know. Volcanoes played a constant and often decisive role in shaping this balance throughout the Mesozoic. They were not rare catastrophic events, but a continuous geological presence. Somewhere on Earth, every day of those 186 million years, magma was rising and breaking the surface. Large volcanic provinces formed where the crust fractured and vast floods of lava poured out could temporarily alter the global climate, warming the planet with greenhouse gases, then cooling it briefly with reflective ash clouds and sulfur aerosols. The volcanic eruptions associated with the breakup of Pangaea are implicated in at least two mass extinction events during the Mesozoic itself. The geology and the biology were never separate processes. They were always in conversation, always shaping each other, always creating the conditions that the other had to respond to. But there is one more dimension of the Mesozoic that rarely receives the attention it deserves. While dinosaurs walked the land and pterosaurs circled the sky, the oceans were living their own extraordinary, almost incomprehensible existence, a parallel world as rich and strange as anything on land, but separated from it by the surface of the water and largely invisible to the creatures above. If you could stand on the shore of a Jurassic or Cretaceous sea, it might look familiar at first. Waves rolling in, sandy beaches stretching to either side, the cries of pterosaurs overhead, salt on the air, the particular light of late afternoon on open water. But if you had looked beneath the surface, you would have entered something else entirely. There were no whales, no dolphins, no seals, no sea lions, none of the marine mammals that dominate our sense of what a rich ocean looks like. They would not appear for tens of millions of years after the Mesozoic ended. Instead, the seas were ruled by reptiles, by lineages that had independently returned to the water from land-dwelling ancestors, reversing the evolutionary journey in reverse. Ichthyosaurs had bodies shaped so perfectly like tuna or dolphins, large eyes, streamlined torsos, crescent-shaped tails, that they are often cited as a textbook example of convergent evolution. Different lineages arriving at the same form because the same form works best for the same problem. Their eyes were, in some species, the largest of any animal that has ever lived. Vast, light-gathering structures adapted for hunting in dim or deep water. Fossil ichthyosaurs have been found with their last meals still preserved in their stomach regions. Fish bones, squid hooks, the hard beaks of belemnites. They were efficient predators, but they were also, in some respects, surprisingly familiar. Ichthyosaur fossils have been found showing females in the act of giving birth, their young emerging tail first, as in modern dolphins, a detail that suggests a warm, active physiology closer to a modern marine mammal than to a reptile in the conventional sense. Plesiosaurs move through the water on a different principle, four large flippers working in coordinated strokes, a form of underwater flight rather than the fish-like side-to-side undulation of the ichthyosaurs. They came in two very different body plans that coexisted throughout most of the Mesozoic. The long-necked forms, some with necks longer than the rest of their body, were probably ambush predators of fish schools, able to strike sideways with speed before the prey could scatter. The short-necked, large-headed forms, the pliosaurids, were among the apex predators of the Jurassic and Cretaceous oceans, with skulls longer than a man is tall and teeth designed for gripping and tearing large prey. To swim alongside a large pliosaur would have been to understand viscerally what the word predator actually means. In the late Cretaceous, mosasaurs rose to fill many of the ecological roles that plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs had previously occupied, and then exceeded them. These were not ancient aquatic lineages. They were lizards, relatives of modern monitor lizards and more distantly related to snakes, that had made the transition to a fully marine existence within what is, geologically, a very short time. Their legs became flippers, their bodies became streamlined, their tails flattened into vertical propulsive surfaces. Some species reached 15 meters in length. They diversified into fish eaters, shell crushers, open ocean hunters. They dominated the Cretaceous seas the way sharks dominate modern ones, as apex predators present in every ocean, in every latitude, at every depth reachable from the surface. And then, 66 million years ago, they vanished completely. The continental drift that opened the Atlantic and fragmented Pangaea did more than reshape the map. It changed the ocean currents, altered the global climate, created new zones of shallow, warm water where marine life could flourish, and isolated populations of both land and sea animals on different land masses so that they evolved independently for millions of years. The isolation of South America produced some of the largest sauropods that ever lived, because with fewer large predators to constrain them, there was no strong selection pressure against growing to enormous size. The isolation of island Europe, which in the Cretaceous was a shallow archipelago rather than a solid continent, produced dwarf dinosaurs, miniaturized by the limited resources of island environments, following the same rules that produced dwarf elephants and dwarf hippos on real-world islands today. The breaking of Pangaea was not merely a geographical event, it was an evolutionary one, generating diversity through separation the way a prism generates color through refraction. And here is where the most unexpected part of this entire story reveals itself. Among all the great players of the Mesozoic, the dinosaurs that ruled the land, the reptiles that ruled the seas, the pterosaurs that ruled the sky, there was one lineage that rarely gets mentioned in the opening scenes of the Mesozoic story. It hid in the shadows. It came out at night, when the great reptiles slowed. It left no dramatic fossils, no massive skulls, no leg bones the size of columns, no trackways that cover acres of exposed stone, and yet without it, none of us would exist. Mesozoic mammals were tiny, seemingly insignificant creatures. Most were no larger than a mouse or a shrew, gnawing on insects in the leaf litter, retreating to burrows in the heat of the day, moving through darkness at night in a world that barely noticed them. For most of the Mesozoic, that invisibility was their survival strategy. They endured by staying small, staying hidden, and exploiting the ecological spaces that the dinosaurs, too large, too slow, too cold-dependent, could not easily reach. But that very invisibility was, in the end, their greatest advantage. Mammals were warm-blooded, maintaining their body temperature internally, regardless of the temperature around them. They could be active at night when reptiles cooled and slowed. Their relatively larger brains gave them behavioral flexibility, the ability to learn, to adjust, to solve novel problems that their competitors lacked. And generation after generation, they survived. Through the entire age of the dinosaurs, through the climate shifts and the volcanic winters, through the long, slow changes of 100 million years, they held on, quietly, modestly, without spectacular displays of dominance. Because in the long game of evolutionary survival, size does not decide the winner. Adaptability does. And when the great catastrophe finally came, the mammals were ready for a world the dinosaurs had never prepared them for. Now turn your gaze upward, because the sky of the Mesozoic deserves its own full chapter in this story. When we imagine that ancient world, the mind naturally reaches for the ground, the footsteps of giants, the drama of predation, the vast open plains. But the sky above those plains was no less alive, no less contested, no less varied than anything below. It was a separate world entirely, with its own rulers, its own evolutionary experiments, its own slow revolution that is still unfolding today. The first pterosaurs appeared in the late Triassic, not long after the dinosaurs themselves. They were small creatures, wings supported by a single enormously elongated finger on each hand. The fourth finger stretched to a length that dwarfed the other three, with a membrane of skin and muscle running from its tip down the side of the body to the hind leg. Their bones were hollow, the walls thinner in some species than a sheet of paper, their entire skeleton so light that a creature with a 2-meter wingspan might weigh no more than a large cat. Even the earliest pterosaurs could glide and maneuver with precision, and the evidence suggests that many of them could achieve powered flight from the beginning. Not evolved gliders that gradually learned to flap, but true flyers from the start, the product of an evolutionary transition we have not yet fully traced. By the Jurassic, they had diversified into an extraordinary range of forms, filling niches from insect eater to fish hunter to scavenger to filter feeder, each body plan shaped by the demands of its particular way of life. Some had long, straight jaws lined with fine teeth for catching fish in skim feeding runs across the water surface. Others had short, deep skulls like modern puffins, adapted for diving and catching slippery prey underwater. Some had elaborate bony crests on their skulls that may have functioned in thermoregulation, species recognition, or sexual display, possibly all three at once, as the best biological structures so often serve multiple purposes simultaneously. They were as diverse in the sky as dinosaurs were on the land, and for much of the Mesozoic, they were its uncontested masters. As time passed, pterosaurs grew to sizes that challenged the imagination. By the late Jurassic, wingspans of 10 meters were not uncommon among the largest species. By the late Cretaceous, Quetzalcoatlus northropi had achieved a wingspan estimated at 10 to 12 meters, wider than most small aircraft, and when it stood on the ground, it would have looked a tall man squarely in the chest, its long neck rising above him to a beaked head the size of a kayak. These were not simply large versions of smaller pterosaurs. They were animals operating at the very edge of what the physics of flight will permit, using soaring techniques to stay aloft for days at a time with minimal expenditure of energy, covering enormous distances between feeding grounds in the way that albatrosses cross oceans today. But pterosaurs were not the only ones who filled that sky, because while they reigned over the open air, another experiment was quietly taking shape in the forests. A quieter, smaller, less dramatic experiment, but one that would outlast everything the pterosaurs had built. The first birds emerged from within the theropod dinosaurs in the Jurassic, not as a sudden leap, but as a gradual accumulation of features over millions of generations. Feathers had appeared much earlier, not originally for flight, but probably for insulation or display. Over time, in some lineages, those feathers became more elaborate, more aerodynamically functional, more capable of generating lift. The famous Archaeopteryx, preserved in the fine-grained limestone of what is now Bavaria, sat near the beginning of that transition, a creature with feathered wings capable of at least gliding flight, but also with the teeth, wing claws, and long bony tail of its dinosaurian ancestors. Not quite bird, not quite dinosaur. Something in between, something that represented a possibility becoming real. Through the Cretaceous, birds diversified rapidly. They lost their teeth, They shortened their tails into the compact bony stub that modern birds use as a mounting point for tail feathers. Their flight became more refined, their wing anatomy more efficient, their ecological range more diverse. By the end of the Cretaceous, birds were already occupying most of the niches that modern birds occupy. There were diving forms, shorebird forms, perching forms, forms that fed on fish, and forms that fed on seeds. They lived alongside pterosaurs for tens of millions of years, the two groups coexisting in the sky much as they might have coexisted in a modern ecosystem. Different sizes, different techniques, different niches, rarely in direct competition. Until the very end, pterosaurs remained unmatched in size. Their end came not because birds outcompeted them. It came with the same event that ended everything else. Because at the close of the Cretaceous, something arrived from space. The world that had existed for 186 million years, the world of giants and inland seas and soaring pterosaurs and warm polar forests, fell apart in less than a human lifetime. The pressure that preceded the end had been building for hundreds of thousands of years. Massive volcanic eruptions in what is now India, the Deccan Traps, a flood basalt province that poured lava across nearly 1 million square kilometers, had been releasing carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere at elevated rates, gradually warming and destabilizing ecosystems that had been stable for millions of years. The climate was already shifting. Dinosaur diversity may already have been declining. And then, around 66 million years ago, an asteroid roughly 10 kilometers across struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico at a location called Chicxulub, at a speed of perhaps 20 kilometers per second. The energy released in that impact exceeded the combined power of every nuclear weapon ever built by many millions of times over. The rock at the impact site was vaporized instantly. Debris was hurled into the upper atmosphere and beyond, spreading around the planet within hours. As that debris rained back down through the atmosphere, it was heated by friction to incandescence, briefly turning the sky into an infrared oven that may have ignited vegetation across much of the globe. Shock waves from the impact triggered earthquakes of a magnitude that dwarfs anything in recorded human experience. Tsunamis, hundreds of meters tall, raced across the Gulf of Mexico and beyond. And then, as the immediate violence faded, the longer and in some ways more devastating consequence began. Dust and soot from wildfires and from the impact itself filled the stratosphere and blocked sunlight across the entire planet. Photosynthesis slowed and then, in many regions, stopped. The base of virtually every food chain on Earth collapsed. Global temperatures dropped sharply, then swung erratically as different components of the atmospheric disruption played out over months and years. The non-avian dinosaurs, every last one of them, from the smallest ornithischians to the largest sauropods, disappeared. Marine reptiles, ichthyosaurs, had already gone extinct earlier in the Cretaceous, but plesiosaurs and mosasaurs were wiped out. The pterosaurs that had ruled the sky for over 150 million years, gone. The ammonites that had drifted through every ocean on Earth since before the Mesozoic began, gone. Perhaps 3/4 of all species alive at that moment vanished within a geological instant. And yet, not everything died. Small mammals hiding in burrows survived the long impact winter by feeding on seeds, roots, and carrion, food sources that persisted when fresh vegetation was gone. Certain birds, particularly those with varied diets, and the ability to subsist on seeds and detritus made it through when their pterosaur competitors could not. Crocodiles, with their ability to fast for months and their tolerance for cold, persisted in rivers and swamps. Turtles endured. Small lizards and snakes found refuge in cracks and burrows and the slowly recovering soil. Some plants survived as dormant seeds and spores, waiting in the darkened earth for the light to return. The earth did not die. It went quiet. And then, slowly, over thousands of years, and then tens of thousands, and then millions, it began again. And in what follows that terrible moment lies the deepest truth of the Mesozoic, one that is rarely spoken aloud in its full weight. All of that great drama, all 200 million years of it, led directly to a single consequence for us. Without the asteroid, the mammals that survived the Mesozoic might have remained small for millions of years more, constrained by a world still shaped by the needs and dominance of the dinosaurs above them. But the catastrophe that destroyed the giants opened the world to everything that had been waiting in the margins. The niches where giants had stood were vacant. The ecological roles that dinosaurs had filled for over 100 million years were suddenly available, and the mammals, warm-blooded, flexible-brained, fast-reproducing, adaptable, moved into them with remarkable speed. Primates emerged. Brains grew larger, generation by generation, responding to selection pressures we are still working to fully understand. Social complexity increased, and tens of millions of years after the last non-avian dinosaur fell, we appeared, curious, restless, capable of standing in a museum and looking up at a sauropod skeleton and asking what the world was like when it was alive. Every human walking today is a living echo of that survival, a testament to the creature in a burrow that endured the Earth's darkest winter and ultimately gave rise to everything we are. But the Mesozoic itself, it has not truly disappeared. Not really. Every pigeon on a city street, every crow perched on a fence post, every hawk soaring above an autumn field is a direct descendant of theropod dinosaurs, their hollow bones and feathers and egg-laying a living inheritance from the Jurassic and Cretaceous. When you hear a sparrow singing at dawn, you are hearing, if you listen for it, the faint, distant voice of creatures that shared their world with Triceratops and Ankylosaurus, filtered through 66 million years of change, but unbroken. The very act of flight, so effortless in a gull skimming the surf, so precise in a hummingbird hovering before a flower, is a living continuation of experiments in the sky that began with the first pterosaur spreading its membrane on a Triassic morning. The flowering plants that dominate our forests, gardens, and farmlands, every fruit we eat, every field of grain, every oak and maple and flowering cherry, are the descendants of the quiet revolution that began in the Cretaceous, when the first petals unfolded and the first insects carried pollen between them. That revolution changed the world's food supply, its smell, its color, its sound, because flowers brought pollinators, and pollinators brought diversity, and diversity brought the richness of the modern living world. Even the shapes of the continents and oceans we know today were determined during the Mesozoic. The breakup of Pangaea, the opening of the Atlantic, the drift of India toward Asia, the isolation of Antarctica, all of these movements, completed or set in motion during the Mesozoic, wrote the geography that every human civilization has lived within. Fossils are echoes, silent but profound. When a paleontologist brushes rock from a fossil bone, they are not merely uncovering an object. They are making contact with a life. A trackway frozen in ancient mud records the pressure of a foot that has not existed for 100 million years. A nest of fossilized eggs holds in stone the moment of an attempt to carry life forward, the same impulse that drives every parent in every species that has ever lived. Museums are full of these voices, these pressed flowers of deep time, and every time we stand in front of them, we are doing something remarkable, reaching across an almost incomprehensible distance and touching something real. There is something profoundly humbling in the realization that the ground beneath our feet holds these memories. The Mesozoic is not a fairy tale of monsters. It is part of the actual foundation of our world, the source of our birds, our flowering plants, our continental geography, our very existence as a species. By studying it, we learn not only about the past, but about how life works, how it responds to catastrophe, how it finds its way through impossible conditions, how it builds complexity from simplicity, and then watches complexity collapse and builds it again. When we think about the environmental changes unfolding in our own time, the Mesozoic offers both a warning and a kind of strange comfort. It warns us that the stability we depend on is not guaranteed, that ecosystems can collapse faster than they can recover, that conditions can shift past points of no return, and yet it also reminds us that life in some form has always found a way through. Not every lineage, not every ecosystem, but life itself, stubborn, adaptive, improbably persistent. Where are we in this long, unfinished story? We are one moment in it, late and recent and extraordinary and fragile. The Mesozoic teaches us patience because it shows us time on a scale that makes our own seem like the blink of an eye. It teaches us humility because it shows us how many forms of greatness have risen and fallen before we ever arrived. And it teaches us awe, a word that has almost worn out from overuse, but that here earns its full weight, because the world it describes, the world of giants and inland seas and sky-filling pterosaurs and forests without flowers, was as real as the room you are sitting in right now. It was not a myth, it was the earth. And so, when you step outside tomorrow and hear a bird sing, when you see flowers opening in spring light, when you look up at mountains on the horizon, or watch a river carving its unhurried path toward the sea, you are standing in the echo of that world. The Mesozoic is not locked away in stone. It is in the life around you, in the landscape beneath you, in the birds above you, and in the curious, restless, wondering creature that you are. This is where we will leave our journey today. If you have enjoyed wandering through these ancient worlds with the first Earth, consider subscribing and joining us the next time we go somewhere deep and slow and worth the patience. There is no rush here. Time is given room to unfold the way the Earth itself unfolds. Thank you for being with us, and may your own days and nights carry a little of that same wonder the Mesozoic left behind.